Today's conversation is going to be focused on gender and medicine, both the learning of medicine, the practice of medicine, and how gender impacts the people who are in the medical profession. I'm Suchitra Dalvi. I'm a gynecologist and also coordinator of the Asia Safe Abortion Partnership. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guests here today for the conversation. We have Dr. Ea Mulligan, Rola Yasmine, and Shweta Poduwal. Ea Mulligan told us that she came out into women's liberation in 1975 and then decided to reform medicine by becoming a doctor. She retired before patriarchy was eliminated from the medical curriculum, unfortunately, and we're looking forward to some very interesting conversations around that. Rola Yasmine, I am delighted to say, is one of the youth champion alumni of ASAP and now the founder of the A project based in Beirut, Lebanon. She's also a nurse by training, but I think that doesn't do enough justice to the contribution she's making to sexual and reproductive health rights issues in the community, both nationally, regionally, as well as globally. And we are hoping to hear some exciting stories from her perspective as well. Shweta Poduwal is a final year medical student based in Mumbai, and she has been very actively involved with the work of the India Safe Abortion Youth Advocates, which is a national affiliate of the Asia Safe Abortion Partnership, very actively involved in the gender and rights issues involving the medical students as well as the laws and practices in the country in general. So I'm delighted that all of us have managed to come together for this conversation. So my first question is going to be for Ea. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a medical student, Ea? You said you joined medicine and you wanted to become a doctor to change the system from the inside. So what was it about the process that made you understand how gender issues were represented or dealt with or ignored within the system at the time? And what made you the activist and medical educationist that you are now?
I think I've always been shocked at how many really smart, capable women go into medical school and come out the other end believing that they're idiots and they know nothing. It seems to be a very undermining experience, and a lot of the teaching methods, I mean, are, at the time that I was training, humiliation and bullying were considered to be useful teaching tools, and terrifying you by threatening to fail you at all times. I mean, I went into a course that had newly been invented where they had continuous assessment, which really meant there were final exams in each subject each term that you would never go back to that again. And so you had to pass everything or you were sunk. And so it just led to very anxious, fearful people who always felt as though they hadn't read enough and didn't know enough. And, we had these ward rounds where the most senior doctor would stand everyone around the bed and then ask questions of the most junior people. And if you didn't know the answer, I mean, it was just hideously embarrassing. Yeah. And of course, the patient felt as though they weren't there at all. So it was, the philosophy of the era was embedded into the medical school curriculum, which is not surprising. Why wouldn't it be? Of course. But I was certainly very strengthened and heartened, and it made me feel less like I was going mad to know that there was a feminist movement outside of medical school that I could be part of, and there were women arguing for, a better treatment of women outside. And I found the course so difficult to contend with. I dropped out several times, and at one time I went and worked in a women's community health center and had the opportunity to try out some of the things that I thought might be better. And, over the years, that's been a very interesting experience to look back on, because we really felt as though if we just talked about domestic violence and child sexual abuse, that the world would change and that we would be providing a model of care that would be taken up and replicated, because of course it would be so successful. And of course it wasn't. And these were tiny demonstration projects that just reached a few women, and the rest of the world kept right on going the way it always had. So, and sort of in, you know, the hospices were like that too. They said people are having awful deaths in hospital and it could be done so much better. And look, here, we'll show you how you could do it better. But they never, their critique was never absorbed into the mainstream system.
You're absolutely right. And I mean, listening to you, I'm reflecting back on my experience, and it was very much similar. You know, this kind of institutionalized bullying in the framing of grand rounds. Or as you said, you know, you worked on issues, say, of domestic violence. And I was remembering as a gynecology resident, one of the things we had to attend calls for was in the burns ward. And in India, you may know that dowry is a huge issue. And there used to be, at the time in the 1980s, when I was a medical student, mid-1980s, there was a huge spate of these what were called dowry deaths. So these were women who were burnt alive, usually by the in-laws family. And they would turn up in the hospital at, say, 2 in the morning, usually, saying that, oh, I was trying to cook and, you know, my sari caught fire. That was the standard story. It's like, you know, we have that I walked into a cupboard kind of story. So this was the story we used to get. And I must tell you, Ea, nobody talked to us about what is really going on behind these stories. So for a long time, and you know, as residents, you're very busy and you're so involved with other things, is not a priority. And it didn't occur to me till much later. I'm like, how come, what are they cooking at 2 in the morning? Like, why are these all young women? Like, you know, nothing was really making sense, but there was no connection of this with the misogyny and the violence and the torture really that women were suffering outside. And we just carried on with our work because there's always someone in labor, there's someone, you know, with eclampsia, there's someone with hemorrhage. So these issues really fall by the wayside. And I think reflecting on that, I just want to ask Shweta whether you have anything to add, because I'm not sure medical education has necessarily changed really much for the better now either. Is there anything you want to share?
I mean, it's honestly still very similar. Like when Ea was sharing her part of it, it's still quite similar. There's still a lot of that same, you know, bullying kind of within the system. It's a system of negative reinforcement rather than, you know, just even trying to not at the preset assume things about the students that you are teaching. And there's definitely, like, we're still a long way from kind of having proper lessons about sensitizing us to the topics and, you know, the social issues that our patients may come with either. We're taught to just, you know, treat the physical part, but not taught to really look beyond that. And that's still quite missing, I think.
Yeah. So I think that's what we constantly talk about, is that medical education is still very biomedical focused. Whether it's for doctors or for nurses, we're never really spoken to about social determinants. No one talks to us about the larger ideological framings, you know, within the context of which we are going to practice as you know, doctors or nurses. So I want to ask you, Rola, I know you are one of our lead trainers. You talk very beautifully about, you know, the origins of modern medicine and how it has these roots in patriarchy. So, you know, these attempts, small attempts that some of us are making. And I must say, yeah, thank you so much to your generation, because the fact that we can do this now and say this now is because we are standing on the shoulders of people like you who went ahead of us and recognize this need, you know, so early on. But Rola, can you tell us a little bit more about how, you know, the modern medicine has its roots and foundations in patriarchy, and why that makes it so difficult for us to bring about the change we are all struggling for?
Yeah, so from my readings from, for example, like you know, the book of Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, a history of women healers, and also other books from that time that also looks at the sexual politics of sickness. We, you know, there's a lot that really points to the fact that medicine as a field, how it was professionalized, was obviously professionalized within framing of patriarchal control, and for the benefit of not only, or the advantage of not only men, and but also of men of a certain class, of men of a certain color and race, and you know, so that elites stay elites as well within that, and especially that this is a field that that requires not, I say requires very specifically, and not has gained rightfully respect, that it actually requires and demands respect and has a lot of politics of respectability attached to it. And that's kind of looking back at how that started is, you know, that it was very obvious that, you know, what was called witches back then, which are women healers, who were also part of, you know, healing and helping with peasant uprisings, especially in feudal times and all that. You know, they were people who knew, you know, what to do with sage, what to do with belladonna, what to do with like rosemary, what to do with the, you know, nature's herbs as medicinal, you know, purposes, and as well as learning about the body and anatomy and what goes where and how to heal broken bones and such, and that was called witchcraft. And you know, women were burnt for knowledge that is otherwise now known as science, but back then was actually perceived as magic. And what was back then perceived as science is what we call today
Quackery.
bullshit. Yeah. No, I mean, it's, you know, like for example, you know, writing on a wound, or like, you know, I mean, you know, they kind of like chanting things at a wound. It just didn't make sense. And back then it was more like clerics or people in religion who were allowed to practice medicine. And so we don't see that much of a distance from, you know, the church, the state, and medicine, that used to really kind of be this like trilogy that worked together. And you know, what the three of them have in common is massively sexist and misogynist a lot of times, and you know, putting women second, if not third, if not fourth, and kind of, and this is how the medicalization around women's bodies kind of eventually kind of come out to showing. What's important to say is that women who were doing the healing back then, you know, with the professionalization of this field, were not able to continue healing, because now they're like they're outcasted as being unofficial or irregular, which is really not okay, thinking that the person who was doing all this healing all of a sudden is now, you know, doesn't have the degree for it, couldn't go to medical school for 7 or 8 years for it because of, you know, domestic labor you have to do, because the resources of the family are not geared towards you, because you don't have that kind of time, so you should anyway just become a nurse, which is also a very gendered profession. But I definitely see the connection of how things kind of came out from back then on very, you know, sexist, you know, classist and racist, you know, foundations, still finding its way into what we know today to be medicine and medical field of practice and healthcare, you know, because it's built on shaky grounds. And I think that's the hardest part.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, I mean, as you said, as a profession, it had its roots in all the patriarchal classism. And I know we've reflected on this earlier also, that if you had to dedicate yourself to say 5 years of medical schooling, you obviously couldn't earn a living, and that automatically eliminated a lot of people. But I just want to ask, so reflect on the fact, if you could tell us, it's not just medicine as a system, but also the way we deal with as healthcare professionals, but also how do we look at people in the community? You know, the kind of gender blindness of the medicine, or sometimes the prejudices, because we know that the word hysteria, which had, you know, medical connotations, actually emerged from a belief that women's uterus kind of wandered around and affected their brain, and that's what made them emotionally, you know, labile and volatile. And very often the treatment would be as radical as doing a hysterectomy, even if she probably hadn't had children or was you know, unmarried. So what is your sense of how medicine as a profession has treated women who come to it for healing?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that science is a method, it's not a conspiracy. That is, it's true that the knowledge and the access to university education and the development of the technologies has all been in the context of very deep class divides as well as patriarchy. And, you know, this is why all of the vaccine manufacturing capacity in the world is now in the private sector and things like that. But at the same time, there's a struggle and a negotiation going on all the time within it, and somehow there have been fringe benefits for women. And I mean, just looking at the technologies of abortion and contraception, those have been enormously valuable to women generally, and enabled women to have more control and steer their lives better than they could without them. So it's tempting to become hostile to the technologies themselves, and yet they're actually just tools. And if you can put the tools into the women's hands, then a lot of things can get better.
That's really wonderful. I mean, I'm glad you're very optimistic about it. But just to say that we should not forget historically. Even if we're not saying it's a conspiracy that the whole system has been against women, but the reality is that medicine as a system has treated women very badly. First of all, by refusing them admission in medical colleges, by saying their brains were smaller, or if they studied so much they wouldn't be able to reproduce, and also by things like medical textbook illustrations never had the clitoris. Hysteria was kind of a blanket diagnosis that you could apply to any woman randomly without much scientific proof. And also, I was reflecting, as you said, there is an Australian, lesbian doctors association, etc. I think medicine has a lot to answer for in terms of pathologizing things which we now recognize as just, variations, and including, for example, ableism. The disability becoming a medical condition rather than a condition of society not being inclusive enough, or even for I think, and Shweta could talk to that a little bit. Our medical textbooks, the forensic textbook had a whole page on virginity. Virginity is not a medical condition. It doesn't need to be pathologized and doesn't need to be treated. But equally, lesbian and gay sex came in the forensic textbook as listed under unnatural sexual behavior. So I think medicine does have a lot to answer for. And as you said quite rightly, medicine is the way to rise above all this. But what we're trying to do is just try and see whether medicine has done enough to rise above all this, and whether, how much of it has actually perpetrated by the medical system. So my next question, actually, I wanted to ask Shweta if you wanted to reflect a little bit on, as Ea said quite rightly, women doctors, medical students, are probably among the most highly educated, who've invested the maximum amount of time in their studies. How do you see this reflecting in choices for post-graduation? Because in my generation, at least, I know that despite all the education and all the empowerment, women in post-graduation ended up taking a backseat or taking jobs which were seen as more family-friendly, marriage-friendly, child-friendly. So does that still work for your generation as well, or have things changed?
I think people our age, and also the thing is, a lot of the awareness of the fact that we have the choice, we don't need to limit ourselves to this. It's still not a lot of medical education that is empowering us, but more of these other spaces. So very similar to how Ea said, there are so many organizations that now work for doctors and specific categories of doctors. Similarly, there are also spaces like our organization, for example, was the place where I learned so much more about my options, what I can be empowered to do, and all of those things. So I feel like that's where that awareness is coming from, and definitely more people these days would not let themselves be limited by their gender. But at the same time, that belief exists. Some people at the end of the day still have these notions that they would choose something that's relatively easier, because, and now it very often there's that feeling that it's not coming from patriarchy, no one's telling them to take it. So when they feel that they can choose that for themselves, it still feels great, and that's great. I mean, that's a choice. But there's still that attitude in the more senior professionals who we still have to work with, So one interesting example of this was, because I mean, I've never seen something so obvious. I know very often people say that certain professions are better for women and certain professions are better for men in the medical curriculum. So very often they say that professions like dermatology or radiology, which essentially are not linked with emergencies, would be better off for women, and things like surgery, especially specializing in surgery, something that should be left with the men. And I mean, we used to discuss that in our workshops, but literally last year it was me and a male colleague of mine sitting in our cafeteria eating a meal, and this very well-meaning senior professor was sitting in front of us and then just started talking to us, asking us what we are and what we were interested in. And my male colleague is interested in surgery, so he was just telling him that, and he was like great and discussing options with him. And then he asked me, and I was just like, I mean, I like a lot of clinical professions, but I'm not decided yet, which was true. And then he just went on to say, you know, you should really consider dermatology, like time-wise, it would be great for you, and making so many assumptions about me without, you know, knowing, like he knew me for 5 minutes there. And so it still persists. I was really shocked. And I mean, it's not even like he was talking to me alone, you know, there was a stark comparison right there. And people do it and they don't even realize that they do it. And I feel like sometimes this even discourages women from taking some of these professions because you're in these very toxic masculine spaces. So orthopedics is, I think, one of those specialties which for so long, you know, we've been told like it requires manual labor, it's horrible, and like it's not something women can do. So I was really shocked. And now what I hear very often from women is like, don't take it just because you'll be stuck amongst a lot of toxic people. And, you know, that is not something that you would want to be stuck between. So now we recognize that there is that gender inequality there, but we do not put ourselves in that space because of how uncomfortable it could be, which I think is
so you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So I think that's what we were trying to, you know, say, that there are many of these frameworks which intersect somehow in medical colleges. So you've got the patriarchy, the misogyny, the toxic masculinity, plus you've got this whole neoliberal framework that most people want to start private practice, so they want to do sub-specialization, super specialization. So, you know, we were discussing just before the call started that, you know, exams, constantly giving entrance exams for undergraduate, postgraduate. So where is all this helping us to become healers? You know, how do we then interact with the system? Rola, I think it would be great if you could respond. Are doctors, or is the medical profession doing enough, given that it has so much power, it has so much privilege? And to me, particularly as a gynecologist and as a woman gynecologist, I feel we bear witness to so much that patients go through, which are violations. You know, whether it's an unwanted pregnancy, whether it's a person who's been raped or sexually abused, whether it's a woman who's, you know, facing domestic violence. How do we as individuals work with the system, both as, you know, to improve agency for the patients we see, but also to really, as Ea said, maybe not take guns and, you know, destroy everyone. But I think what she's trying to say is shake the foundations, right? Break down these walls. How do we work to transform? Do you think we are doing enough? Because my sense is we really aren't. And it's not because we don't want to, it's because we don't know how to. Or we are all, many of us, like all of us in the profession aren't empowered enough or articulate enough to even have these conversations. You know, many people are just part of the system themselves. Not necessarily as victims, but they just become part of the system. They're not really the ones who are going to rebel against it. So if you could just reflect on where you see us as a profession, you know, playing a role in changing the world.
I do think that there's, you know, like pretty much any historical old injustice, there are reparations that need to happen. Some of these, they happen, you know, when medical institutes, you know, for example, if we think about Henrietta Lacks, you know, who gave her HeLa cells for science, that, you know, acknowledgement, apology, you know, and being able to do reparations is important. I think that there's a much bigger stance, you know, like in terms of, you know, trans bodies and queers, migrants, prisoners, you know, people who, you know, lived under slavery have all kind of contributed against their will to the progression of science and medical sciences. There has to be, I think, what isn't happening enough is that this knowledge that there's been these grand injustices and oppressions, of which medicine stepped on, like built its knowledge on, that there has to be these reparations, but also reparations aren't only retroactive, they're also prospective, which means looking at these medical textbooks, they cannot still be seeing people in a biomedical, you know, stripped from, you know, agency and context and political existence in a place anymore. It's it's almost as offensive that not only patients are treated this way, but that actually physicians are treated this way too. Doctors are treated this way. You're put in a position where you're literally taught against thinking in that way, so that you can do and not ask too much, or think that this is beyond the scope of your practice, when apparently everything is the scope of your practice. What a 10-year-old will do when she grows up or learn is in your practice. So why not social justice? Why not reproductive justice? So I think that that's, thinking about the curriculums is one. Thinking about how this is taught is definitely very important. But I also think that there has to be a major reimagining of what this professionalization looks like. In terms of how it's taught as well, how much of this is necessary, how much of it is useful for these many years, hyper specializations and medicalizations, the marriage, for lack of a better word, between capitalism and science and medical health, the profession being attached to an economic system that builds on disparity is not okay. It loses the sense of what medicine is supposed to provide, and nursing as well. Nursing science also falls victim to that system as well, within a different lens completely, but we can talk about that another time. So I think that there is something to think about. Medicine does not exist in a vacuum, and we cannot treat it this way. And if you do preach, and a Hippocratic oath of some sort, then there is a huge socialist left element to how we want medicine to be practiced. Nobody should have to die of not being able to afford care, or being given purposefully wrongful information that ends to you hurting yourself, or being denied a service such as abortion care also. So there, I think there's a lot of work. How much is being done? I think things are better in the sense that there is a rising sense of feminist consciousness that is just so present in the last 15, 20 years that it's almost hard to avoid the conversation of gender justice, that it seeps in, and that noise around medicine is no longer around, and it's definitely seeping in. We have a few members of the A Project who are med students. You can see they have a fire in their belly and they're not afraid to show it. A lot of nursing students also really being vocal about, the rights that they know they should have as practitioners, and not being, reduced to like secretarial work, or being told to do meaningless things that you've studied way too much and worked way too hard to not be allowed to do your role. So this is, that change is apparent, and it's not without thanks to all the people who have been mobilizing so strongly around.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, speaking of the whole nursing and gendering, when we were medical students, and I don't know if it's still true for Shweta, all the women who are medical students would almost always be addressed as a nurse by the patients and their relatives. The assumption being, if you're a woman in a white coat, you're a nurse. And all the male students were always addressed as doctors. And we used to initially find that funny, then we found it annoying, then we found it, infuriating. But it was impossible to get people to change. I don't know, Shweta, what is your experience as a female medical student in terms of how people approach you?
I mean, I'm not even a doctor yet, and I've already, been called a nurse. And I think, like, more than anything, it's that assumption. And there are a lot of people, I think, who are studying medicine, and everyone's experienced it at some point, and very often it's with male colleagues who, like, around male colleagues who may, in that moment not know much, or maybe junior than you, in which case, like, it's just that assumption hurts. I think that's
Right.
it's still true.
Right.
Yeah.
But so, Ea, I wanted to ask you, now with this whole COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing that the frontline healthcare workers, as well as the doctors, most often, I was reading a statistic somewhere that about 65% of frontline health workers are female health workers, either because they are doctors or because they're nurses, or, they are kind of health providing technicians. And they have very, very unique issues while being frontline health workers in the pandemic. If you're wearing a PPE and you're on your period, you can't change your sanitary napkins for about 8 hours. Those who are pregnant are not able to eat or drink or get rest. So how is the perception in Australia right now in terms of, women being part of the healthcare profession? Is there anything being said about it in the media? Is there a different viewpoint on the role that they're playing?
There are a lot of things going on at once. So one thing that's going on that I think is quite constructive and helpful is that people who know what they're talking about, like epidemiologists, are getting a lot of recognition and deference from politicians. So I never thought I'd see the day when our Prime Minister is giving a press conference and right next to him, socially distanced away, is the Chief Health Officer.
Amazing.
And they're actually deferring to each other. So the Prime Minister says, oh, that's really a question for the Chief Health Officer. And then the Chief Health Officer says, no, that's really a political decision. You'll have to ask the Prime Minister about that. And I think that's very helpful. I think that's vastly more helpful than the conspiracy theories. And but I'm shocked at the extent to which Donald Trump has got a direct line into the brains of people in suburban Adelaide, which is the city I live in. Like, I mean,
really,
he puts out his tweets and then they get retweeted. And I was waiting to have my car registered and I had to wait in a line, and someone came along after me who was clearly psychotic, who decided that he'd start talking to all of us about how COVID-19 is a myth. It's really all being caused by the 5G telephone network, and doctors are making people sick. And he doesn't believe anything he sees on TV. He gets all his news from Twitter. And this guy is just channeling Donald Trump. Like, he said at least 10 things that I've actually heard Donald say on the news. And I think it's almost as though modern leaders are kind of bypassing the entire machinery of government and going, actually, I live in a fantasy world and you can all live in my fantasy world too.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, to me, this sounds like the reception that people gave to doctors who spoke of the germ theory, right? When they were asked to wash their hands. And Semmelweis was actually, I mean, he ended his life in a place where he was in an asylum. You know, they kind of gaslighted him and made him out to be absolutely crazy. So it's no different from this whole 5G. It's just a different reference, but more of the same. You know, the wheel turns and we're back to where we belong, which is really terrifying in many ways. In fact, this conversation on COVID and your reflections remind me of Rudolf Virchow's very famous quote. He is considered to be the founder of social medicine. And that's also something we've reflected on before. They usually call the father of gynecology, father of pathology. There's never any mothers of anything, because at that time they just didn't let women into medical colleges. So right there, you can see the discrimination happening. But anyway, he was tasked apparently with trying to control the typhus epidemic in Prussia, and he failed. And he wrote a booklet on his experiences, and a quote of his which became very famous. He said that medicine is nothing but a social science. And politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale. So your observation about, your prime minister and the chief medical officer sharing a platform. And I really wonder whether as a result of this pandemic, we are likely to see more capacity or more opportunities for medical professionals to input into very, very important issues, as Rola also reflected on, the private health sector, a socialist healthcare system. Where medicine is not meant only for private profit. So is there anything you want to say kind of in closing, Shweta and Rola? Then we would love to hear from you.
I think we're moving towards some sort of progress, or like at least an appearance of progress, but slowly, and it's really, really slow. It can be accelerated very quickly by just, in my opinion, changing a lot of systems that govern medical education to begin with. So whether it's just changing the curriculum as a whole, to make it more inclusive, because right now we learn things in such binaries and it's not okay. And we're told what is appropriate and what is not. We are told to focus on so many side effects of things rather than, realizing that some of these things are very natural, they're very rare.
Right.
And at the same time also, looking at health disparities, there needs to be like a major transformation, honestly, at a research level, at a clinical level, at an education level when it comes to healthcare. And I think one of the major things, and this is a realization I've had over the last few months, that it's not just enough to just sensitize people, but actually work against those systems that you're brought up in. Because until you reach your university level education, you're already out there in the world, you're already getting in so much information.
Right.
So you're already being exposed to a lot of attitudes that people have, whether it's about people with disabilities, whether it's about people being able to control their own fertility, whatever it is. We're already being told so much by the world around us, by media, by our families, by society. And medical education can't just sensitize people about it, but it needs to actively, remove those attitudes.
Right.
Because unless we address that, I feel like it then translates into those specific healthcare outcomes, whether it's when you're talking about race or about gender or whatever else it is, because it's those same attitudes, but now they're just reflecting in healthcare specifically. And that's how it's becoming like a systemic issue. So I think we really need to work to address, because I feel like it takes a long time to understand exactly how patriarchy works and then to slowly work down. And another kind of thing is that human rights, I feel like we're not taught about it enough. But for me, like once I understood the concept of human rights, it becomes very easy. I'm not faced with a lot of ethical dilemmas about what I would do. It's that basic, it's that fundamental.
We need to bring back this politics that we have been talking about, the four of us, and that we believe in, into areas of practice, not only on a patient level, not only within the field and the college and the university. We're talking about mass scale of what it means about the people who don't get the healthcare, the people who are particularly demonized. If we think about what's happening with ICE and hysterectomies in the US that came out just last week, these are
absolutely
like days that,
terrifying.
I mean, this is not new, and yet this is very political, very real, and it needs to be brought into the fact that the military uses medicine and science to crack down on people, and that we won't have it, that this is not how we see it.
Yeah. When the Nazis first started recruiting, doctors as a profession was the first and the largest group to join in with them. So, we've had a history of not having very good judgment.
We need to understand, the politicization of healthcare past, past all of these things, into the stuff that we learn, that we are trying to progress politically, that they're not, them and medicine are not distant. They're very much together.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's the most perfect way to end this. So I'm not going to say any more. But thank you very much to all of you for joining in this conversation. And it's been absolutely delightful. I'm sure we could have gone on for another couple of hours, but I think this brings it to a really organic kind of a close. So we look forward to further conversations with you. Hope all of you stay well and safe. And thank you so much for joining us here again.